Good morning. I'm Shannon with the Pikes Peak Library District, and today we're going to discuss the Tails and Tails cross-stitch crafting kit. We have a couple of examples here for what we'll be doing today. So you can either choose to do the Live, Love, Bark or the Live, Love, Meow, whichever one you prefer. And we're going to go over both of those in detail in a moment. Before we get started, I do want to make sure that everyone who's participating in this class knows that it's really important to be patient with yourself when you're doing these sorts of classes, particularly if this is the first time that you've ever cross-stitched. Cross-stitching is very repetitive. And you're going to be making the same motions over and over again. And you might want to consider doing this over a period of days rather than sitting down and trying to do it in one session. It can be really frustrating if you continue to do it. You may make your hands tired, you may make your eyes tired. So please do not feel like you actually need to sit down and do this in one session. So make sure you give yourself lots of time and you're very patient while you're doing this. So let's get started on what we're going to need as far as materials today and some general preparation guidelines. So if you've received the kit, the Tails and Tails cross-stitch kit, you should have available some materials already, and that will include a skein of embroidery thread, and we have it in black and red, the little hoop, which is about 3 inches in diameter, an embroidery needle, which is a very small needle, but also blunt. It will make it easier for you. The cross-stitch fabric, which should be a small piece like this, and the template. And of course, in addition, the instructions. The things that you want to make sure that you have on hand to complete the project are you're going to want a pair of scissors, of course. A ruler is helpful, and a pencil can be helpful just depending on how you prefer to work. And of course, you'll want the instructions as well. In addition, there are a few things that I also find helpful when I'm doing cross-stitch work. One of those things is painting tape, and I'll show you why that's helpful momentarily. For this particular project, I also find that you can use some sort of glue. I use a fray check. It helps keep it from unraveling once you finish the process. I also find it helpful to have very inexpensive needle threader that tends to help out with the whole process. And for this particular project, I also used just a regular sheet of cardboard. And again, I'll show you why. These are not necessarily these are not necessary materials, but they will help. And I'll get to that in a few minutes. So I'm going to scoot some things out of the way. So first of all, of course, you get to decide which of these particular patterns you would like to use. Today, we're going to do the Live, Love, Meow, and I just folded it so that way I could have the other one available to me. And then you can use, in the instructions, you can use the embroidery hoop to maintain tension. You can also, with a smaller project like this, you can also just do it with the fabric, provided that the fabric is not too flexible. This is not, this is kind of a medium flexibility on the fabric, so it's not going to be terrible. But it's an option. It just depends on how you would prefer to work. One thing I do strongly recommend is, I don't know if you can see this very well. I'll put this under the cardboard, but the edges of the cloth start to fray pretty easily. That's pretty typical for cross-stitching cross-stitching fabric. And so it's usually a really good idea to, what I use is I use really easy painter's tape, or you can use masking tape to tape the edges. and that just keeps it from fraying further. Those little threads can actually get into what you're trying to stitch, and that can make it difficult. Not necessary, but it is a nice little thing to do. So I'm just going to go ahead and tape the edges here. Doesn't have to be perfect, of course, but it helps to make sure that any of the sticky parts are taped down so they don't attach to threads or anything of this sort. All right. And because, again, this is a small project, I am not going to use the embroidery hoop. I find it gets a little bit more in the way, except I am going to use it to determine where to start the project. So if I center the hoop, it kind of gives me an idea of about where I want to start. The recommendation that in the instructions, it is one option to use a pencil and kind of sketch the stitches from the pattern on how you're going to sew. However, most cross stitches counted cross stitch, and counting actually will be more accurate than drawing for me. If you are a very good sketch person, that might be a good option for you, is to go ahead and, as recommended, use underneath to sketch the letters. You can kind of see, not really with the camera here, but you could trace those there to kind of give you a point of starting. I find the counting to work better and more easily. One other quick tip to make sure that we talk about before we begin is to make sure you have really clean hands. This is white fabric, and it will pick up any dirt that you have on your hands or oils or anything like that at all. So just make sure you have really clean hands before you stop. This particular fabric is Ada cloth, and I don't know if you can see. Let me see if I can zoom this a little bit. There we go, that's a little better. So you can kind of see the dots, and those dots are where we're going to be concentrating our stitches on. We've got little dots in the corners. Those are our guides. This is a size 14 Ada cloth, and what that means is that there are 14 stitches in every inch, 14 of these little squares in every inch. So just so you have an idea of what that means, the higher the number, the smaller the stitch. So if you wanted to do something really fine, it would be, you could do 18 or 22. I believe 22 is the highest amount. But for a beginner project, 14 is pretty typical. It's not a bad place to start. So what we're going to do is we're going to begin with threading the needle, and I'm going to unzoom here for a minute. One recommendation with the thread, a lot of times it's very tempting to do a long length of thread because you want to get further with your project. However, if you do that, particularly with embroidery thread, it's going to knot up and cause a lot of problems for you. So the recommendation is no longer than the amount of space between your wrist and your elbow. Shorter is better. It may seem counterintuitive, but you really will make things harder for yourself if you go longer. Once again, you can do that if you so choose. And then before I get started with threading the needle, I just wanted to kind of give you some contrast. So this particular sample that I did, I used, I don't know if you guys can see, but the embroidery thread comes with 6 strands. And it's kind of hard to see the strands, but there are 6 of the little strands in each one of the thicker ones. And it's typical to use 2 strands at a time. Now you can use more, and I wanted to, this is done as 2 strands. I wanted to show you what it looked like if you did some other options as well. So this is, this top example is 1 strand. So it's kind of much lighter. And the bottom one is 3 strands, and that's much heavier. And again, to contrast it with the 2 strands. So just so you're aware, you can do these other options. 2 is generally considered to be sufficient, particularly for a beginner project. 3, it's very bold, but it is a lot harder to work with. And 1 can be a little bit more tricky to work with because it is, you know, just 1 strand of the thread, and that can be kind of tough. All right, so I'm going to move this to the side and get back to my work that we're going to start on. So I've got my 1 strand of embroidery thread, the thick portion, and I'm going to peel off 2 threads. So I'm going to peel them off like this. Okay. And I'm going to knot the end. And I am going to try to go slowly through this for any of you who are not familiar with sewing or cross stitch. So if you are familiar, I hope you'll bear with me. So I'm just going to make a knot, easy knot here. And I double my knots just because I don't want it to pop through. Okay, and I'm going to trim the end so we don't end up with that everywhere. And so I'm going to go ahead and use my needle threader to thread my needle. So you take the end of it, you push it through, and then you're going to use this end, use this end to draw through. All right. So that goes through like that. And there I've got my needle and thread ready to go. Now with the pattern, our little template pattern that we have, we can see here, and I'm going to zoom in again with the camera. So you can see what I'm looking at. So each one of these little squares represents a stitch. So we've got, and for counted, cross stitch is generally a counted sort of thing. So you're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 down, 1, 2, 3 over. So I always try to count twice just to make sure that I'm not getting confused. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then 1, 2, 3. Okay, so 8 down, 3 across. And so now we can set this back to the side a little bit. And we had approximately, we want to give us a little extra room on there. So I'm going to estimate right there for a good starting spot. So when you, let me put the cardboard back behind here again so we can kind of see what this looks like. So in order to do a cross stitch, what we're doing is each one of these little dots is a hole, and we're going to start at one corner and go to the diagonal corner right across from it. And you can, of course, just make X's. Sometimes people find that a bit easier at the beginning. We're just going to make, X's over and over again. It can be a little challenging if you find that you've made a mistake. So usually I recommend just going one diagonal and then going the next stitch diagonal. And I'll show you what that means, what that looks like. And then going back over and doing the second stitch, the second part of the cross stitch. So we're going to begin here with this corner, and then we're going to go down to the next corner. So there's my first diagonal in the cross stitch. And then rather than going on an X, making a direct X, I'm going to come to the block below, the little point below. Let's get in a little closer. There we go. So I'm coming to the point below. And I'm going to pull it tight, but not too tight. If you pull it too tight, you'll end up with all kinds of tension problems in your fabric. So I'm below, and then I'm going to go again diagonal. So that's 2. So remember, we're going 8 down. And then I'm going to go in the corner again. And then into the opposite corner as a diagonal. That's 3. Back to the diagonal is 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. And just because I like to double check, I'm going to go ahead and count those again. If you feel more comfortable just going on, you can go on. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Perfect. All right. And then we need to go 3 across to form the other part of the L. All right. So we're going to go again. We're going to start in the corner. 1, 2, 3. All right, so now we have the first leg of our L. And once again, the reason that I do this is in case you've made a mistake, it is much easier to pull out one of these stitches and to pull out a stitch. The easiest way is just to use your needle rather than like a stitch ripper, but you just draw it back, right back out. So it's much easier to just do the one side if you made an incorrect count, as opposed to fixing all of the X, which can be a little challenging depending on how far you got. All right, so I'm going to rethread my needle. All right, and we're going to put that last third stitch back in. And so now we're going to cross those stitches. So now I'm going to come back and do the other corner. So I'm going to start there and then cross. And on the way back, Since we've already counted all this way, we already know we've done enough stitches, so we don't have to count them again. We're just crossing each one of those, just taking one corner and going from one across. Oops, my thread's trying to come out. Oop, and there it did again. So I found that one of those, one of the cut lengths of the embroidery thread is about enough to do one letter. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. So if that helps you kind of gauge how much you're doing. One last stitch here to finish up. All right. So here's our L. And sometimes when you're doing words like this, sometimes people want to just continue, you know, now that we did the L, we can just do the I. However, I recommend that you stop after every stitch. And it's just a recommendation, of course, but I recommend you stop after every letter that you do, tie that off and start again. Because again, if you make any errors, it can be easier just to go back to the one issue you had. But also behind the lettering or behind the fabric, you can start to see the thread as it crosses from one letter to another. So it is kind of me being picky, but it is something you might want to consider when you're doing yours as to whether or not how you prefer to do it. So let me show you how to finish off the letter. And there are a couple of different ways to tie a knot. Some folks like to go and make kind of a loop and then tie it off this way. And so I went underneath one of the stitches in the back to kind of anchor it together, and then you pull it together. Some people like to just separate the strands of the floss and tie it that way. You do whatever feels best to you. Whichever way you do, you want to make sure you trim off the ends so this doesn't get pulled into further stitches, further letters. All right, so there's the back of it. I'm going to flip it back over again, and my L is done. So right now we've got, we can look at how much space is between each of the letters. I prefer to start from the top. You can start from the top or the bottom. It really doesn't matter. It's whatever makes sense to you. So I see I have 1, 2, 3, 4 blocks, 4 stitches between the L and the I. And the I is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which makes sense because we remember the L was also 8 down. So 4 over and then 8 down. Okay, so I'm going to get a new piece of embroidery thread. Again, 2 strands. Pull it apart. I'm going to go ahead and make my knot. Just a simple overhand knot. And I do 2 just because I want to make sure it's not going to pull through. I'm going to trim off the end. And go ahead and thread the needle. Make sure I give myself some room. All right, and so it was 4 away. So 1, and I count from the back usually when I do it, just so I can go ahead and put the needle through. So this sometimes helps to kind of push the needle through as a way to count. So 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to do a double check. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. And so again, draw the needle through and go to the diagonal. Two. And this is an easy one because it's obviously just a straight line, but it's really good to get in the habit of counting. 3. 4. 5. 6. 7. 8. And then again, we just come from the bottom and go straight back up the top to cross those initial stitches. So 1, 2, all right. And so there's the eye. And again, on the back, we can either loop it around to knot the letter off. I'm just going to split the threads and tie them this way. Give it a couple good knots. And then trim off the excess. All right. All right, so we're going to continue with our pattern. We finished the L and the I, and now we're going to move on to the V. And so I'm going to start by threading my needle. Cut off another length. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and divide my embroidery thread for 2 strands, not the end. Oops. And if they end up, I don't know if you can see this very well, the knots ended up next to each other, so I'm going to go ahead and knot it again. Sometimes that happens. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off the end again, trim off that excess. And thread my needle. And I'm going to consider my pattern here. You see that I'm starting from the top. And again, you can start from the top or the bottom, but there's 2 spaces between the I and the V. And then the V starts with two blocks going down, so 2 stitches going down. So I'm going to start with that. And I'm counting from the back. 1, 2. And I'm just double checking before I go further. 1, 2. So I'm going to make 1 stitch. And then a second one down. All right, and then I'm going to go back and consult my pattern again. There's the pattern. So I did 2 down and then 1, 2 underneath. Looks like a block of 4 underneath. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So here's the 2 next to one another. And then we'll do the 2 beneath. All right, and then we'll go back and consult our pattern again. So we finished the block of 4 here. So now I'm going to go and do 2 down. It's going to be 3 finally. All right. So we're going to do the 2 first, the 2 that are by themselves. And those start directly under the furthest to the right. So 1, 2. Oops. All right, and then we go back and consult our pattern again. And we've got 1, 2, and then 1 over. So 1, 2, 3, kind of a little block in the corner there. And I hope you're seeing that as we're doing this, everything breaks down into kind of smaller pieces. That's the way that it works easiest for me to process it mentally, is to try to figure out how to break it into smaller pieces, bite-sized pieces, so to speak. All right, so now we've finished most of the one side of the V, one of the legs. I'm going to come back to my pattern. And then we've got, just again on the other side, we're going to have 2 stacked on top of each other, and then this one off to the side, okay? So I'm going to start here. All right, there's the one off to the side. And go back to the pattern. And that's the part we just finished. So now we can do two stacked on top of each other, just like we did on the other side. All right, and then we'll go back to the pattern. And once more, we've got this kind of block of 4, so 2 up and 2 over. So we'll go ahead and do it that way. All right, and back to the pattern again. And since we completed this block of 4, now we're just going to do the 2 on top. All right, and so now we have the first diagonal in the cross stitch. So now all we have to do is, like we've done before, go back and cross all of those diagonals. I'm getting part to the end of this thread. So I think I'm going to go ahead and finish this one off here. So I'm going to go ahead and tie it to finish. When you do tie it, you want to make sure it's not twisted. That'll make the knot stand out quite a bit further, and it won't keep it as secure. And then I'm going to trim off the excess. All right. Can trim that a little closer. There we go. All right. And go ahead and grab my next 2 strands of thread. And I'm going to knot the end. Trim off the excess. And grab my threader. Oh my goodness. Some days are harder than others, even with the threader. There we go. And pull it through. And then we're going to come back and continue crossing all those stitches on the V. All right, so there's the completion of the V. And I'm going to go ahead and tie this one off. Trim the end here. I'll grab another strand of thread. I'm going to knot the end as before. All right, and then trim off that excess. And come back and thread my needle. Hopefully I'm having better luck this time. There we go. And got that pulled through. And then I need to go back to my pattern to look at how we're going to do the E. So on the E, it looks like it's one space starting from the top. And what I do on these particular, on letters like this is I actually start at the beginning, so that way I can, at the furthest most point, so I can start here and work my way continuously through rather than starting here, going here, and then having to pull the thread that all the way over here. But you do whatever works best for you, just like we've talked about before. It's more important for you to do whatever works for you, but logically. So I'm getting a little bit of a glare here. I'm going to move the camera over just a hair because I want to make sure you're seeing the grid. So I've got, here is the one between the two letters, the one block we're going to leave blank. And then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 over. So it's going to be 5 total over, and then 4 stitches there. So I'm going to go back to my cloth. I'm going to count from the back so I can go ahead and just go directly through. So there's the one blank. And then 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm going to double check just to make sure I haven't made a mistake in my counting. 1, 1, 2, 3, 4. Very good. Okay. So now I have 4 stitches. For the top of the E. 2. 3, 4. All right, and we go back to the pattern. And after that 4 at the top, there's 2 that go down to form the top of the E, or to form the leg of the E. One, 2. All right, and then we go back to the pattern. And here we've got 1, 2, 3. So 2 lines of 3 to form that middle leg in the E, the middle stroke. One, 2, 3, and then we do the next one down. 1, 2, 3. All right, and go back to the pattern. And just as before on top, when we had the 2 here by themselves, we have 2 more down by themselves. All right, and go back to the pattern. And we finished these 2, so now we just have the 4 across the bottom. Okay, and then we'll be done with the first diagonal for the E. Two, 3, 4. All right, so now we've completed the first diagonal on the E. Now all we have to do is go back and complete the cross. And I'm just going to go back exactly the way we went before. Oops, my thread's getting a little short, so I think I'm going to go ahead and tie this one off. So I'm not going to quite make it to the end. Of the letter. But that happens. So trim off that excess. I'm going to grab a new strand of thread. And again, not cutting it super long. All right. And go ahead and pull off 2 strands. And I'm going to knot the end. Double it to make sure it doesn't pull through. And trim off that little bit of excess there. And grab my needle and my threader. Draw that through. Right. And we can go ahead and finish our E now. And this looks like where I left off. All right, so there we've got the end of our E. So now I just need to fasten it off in the back. And then cut off my excess. All right, so we've got one word done.